It was 6:14 a.m. when Mark Sterling unlocked the front door. He stepped inside the house with the confidence of a man who believed everything was still exactly where he had left it. His suit jacket hung loosely on his shoulders, and clinging to its collar was the faint but unmistakable scent of another woman's perfume. Expensive, sharp, feminine. Mark didn't notice, or maybe he chose not to. He expected the usual scene, the smell of fresh coffee, the low sound of the morning news, and Elena, his wife, standing in the kitchen, calm and trusting, asking him nothing. He already had his lie prepared. A late client dinner, a dead phone battery, falling asleep on the office couch. He had told these lies before, many times, and Elena had believed him every time. Mark closed the door behind him and took 2 steps forward. Then he stopped. The house was silent, not peaceful, empty. There was no coffee, no television, no movement. Mark frowned and loosened his tie. "Elena?" he called casually. No answer. He walked toward the kitchen, his shoes echoing against the marble floor. The counters were spotless, almost sterile. On the center island, where his breakfast was usually waiting, there was only one thing: a thick manila envelope. It was placed neatly in the middle, impossible to miss. A red legal stamp stood out against the brown paper. Mark stared at it for a moment. "That's strange," he muttered. What he didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that his fate had already been decided hours earlier. Just a few hours before, rain had been pounding against the floor-to-ceiling windows of a luxury penthouse at the St. Regis. Inside, the air was warm, heavy with room service, wine, and the lingering trace of intimacy. Mark sat on the edge of the king's Z bed, fastening his gold cufflinks. They were engraved with his initials, MS, a gift from Elena for their 10th wedding anniversary. He didn't look at them. Behind him, tangled in the sheets, Jessica shifted. "You're leaving already?" she asked, her voice thick with sleep. Jessica was 24, confident, ambitious, alive in a way that made Mark feel powerful again. She wasn't quiet like Elena. She didn't ask careful questions or wait patiently for answers. She demanded attention, and Mark liked that. "I have to," Mark said, grabbing his blazer. "Elena thinks I'm in Chicago. My flight lands in 2 hours. If I'm not home by 7:30, the story falls apart." Jessica laughed softly. "You act like your wife is a detective." Mark smirked. "She's not. She trusts me." And he believed that was enough. For nearly 2 years, Mark Sterling, the CFO of a successful architecture firm, had been living a double life: a perfect home in Greenwich, a loyal wife who never questioned him, and a secret affair that made him feel young, desired, and untouchable. He told himself he deserved it. He worked hard. He earned well. Elena had her charity events and book clubs. She was happy. He thought ignorance was kindness. "When are you going to tell her?" Jessica asked suddenly, her tone changing. Mark adjusted his tie. "Not now. After the fiscal year ends. A divorce right now would scare investors." Jessica didn't argue, but she didn't look convinced either. Mark didn't care. He had no intention of leaving Elena. Divorce was expensive, complicated, inconvenient. He wanted everything. And until that morning, he had always gotten it. Driving home, Mark rehearsed his lines out loud. The flight was rough. The client was difficult. "I missed you." He was good at lying. He had been lying to himself for years. As he turned onto Blackwood Lane, a strange feeling settled in his chest. His driveway was empty. Elena's car was gone. She must be out, he told himself. Inside, the silence felt heavier. Upstairs, the bedroom was perfectly neat. The closet door stood open. Mark walked closer. His side was untouched. Elena's side was empty. No clothes, no shoes, no handbags. This wasn't a quick trip. This was a clean exit. His eyes moved to the nightstand. 2 things rested there: her wedding ring and the manila envelope. His name was written neatly. Y on the front. Mark. He opened it. The first page was a legal document, petition for dissolution of marriage. Mark felt the air leave his lungs. He turned the page, then another. Photographs. Him, Jessica, hotels, restaurants, clear, time-stamped. Professional. A private investigator. Mark sat down heavily on the bed, his hands shaking. The woman he thought was weak had been watching, waiting, planning. And now she was gone. Mark didn't move for a long time. He sat on the edge of the bed, the papers spread across his lap, staring at words he could read but couldn't process. Divorce, evidence, legal representation, dates, times, proof. This wasn't an argument. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was an execution. No, he whispered. This doesn't make sense. Elena didn't. Have the money for this. A private investigator. A high-end law firm. He controlled the accounts. He saw every transaction, every dollar, or at least, he thought he did. Mark grabbed his phone and dialed her number. Ring, voicemail. Her voice came on, calm and light. "Hi, you've reached Elena. I can't come to the phone right now." The sound of her voice unsettled him more than silence. "Elena," he said quickly, forcing control into his tone. "This isn't funny. Call me back." He hung up and immediately called again. Voicemail. A pressure built in his chest. Not guilt, not regret, but something colder. Fear. He stood up abruptly and began pacing the room. "Think," he muttered. "Just think." If Elena had moved this fast, she hadn't acted alone. Someone helped her. Someone. With access. Someone who knew how things worked. The answer came to him immediately. David. Mark dialed his business partner without hesitation. David answered on the third ring. "David," Mark said, skipping any greeting. "There's a situation with Elena. She's filed for divorce and—" "Mark," David interrupted. Something in his voice was wrong. Not angry. Not surprised. Professional. "You need to check your email." Mark stopped pacing. "Why?" "The board just finished an emergency meeting." Mark laughed once, sharp and disbelieving. "An emergency meeting? It's barely 7 in the morning." There was a brief pause. "Elena dialed in at 5, David said. Her lawyer spoke on her behalf." Mark's grip tightened around the phone. Why would my wife be talking to the board? Another. Pause. Then David said quietly, "You really didn't know." "Know what?" Mark snapped. "Mark," David said, lowering his voice, "Elena owns 51% of the voting shares." The room seemed to tilt. "That's impossible," Mark said. "She doesn't even work." David exhaled slowly. "Her family funded the company at the start. The anonymous investor you always bragged about? That was her." Mark felt his legs weaken. "She stayed silent," David continued. "Until this morning." "What are you saying?" Mark whispered. "I'm saying you were terminated," David said. "Effective immediately." Mark couldn't breathe. "Security will be waiting if you come to the office," David added. "Don't." The line went dead. Mark stood there, phone pressed to his ear, long after the call had ended. Fired. Not suspended. Not warned. Erased. From the company he thought he ran. From the company his wife owned. He laughed. Short, broken sounds that echoed through the empty room. "This is insane," he said aloud. "This is a mistake." He moved on instinct now. If he could get to the office, face the board, explain himself, he could fix this. He always fixed things. Mark grabbed his car keys and rushed outside. The Porsche sat in the driveway, sleek and flawless. He slid into the driver's seat and pressed the start button. Nothing. He tried again. The dashboard lit up with a message, "Remote access disabled." Mark slammed his hand against the steering wheel. No, this can't be happening. The car wasn't his. It was leased through the company, through Elena. His phone buzzed. Ank alert. Account access restricted. Another vibration. Transaction declined. His breathing turned shallow. "They can't do this," he said, staring at the screen. That's my money. But deep down, a terrible truth was forming. It never had been. Mark rushed back inside and went straight to the wall safe behind the hallway painting, or where the painting used to be. The wall was bare. His hands trembled as he opened the safe anyway. Empty. Inside was only a small handwritten note. "It's with your lawyer, E." She had taken his passport. Mark let out a shout of rage and kicked the cabinet beside him. Pain shot up his leg, but it barely registered. He was trapped. No job, no access to money, no car, no way out. Then he remembered Jessica. She didn't know yet. She loved him, or at least she loved what he gave her. The apartment, the gifts, the lifestyle. She would help him. She had to. Mark dialed her number. She answered quickly. "What?" "Jess," Mark said, forcing calm into his voice. "I need you." There was a pause. "I know," she said slowly. "Know what?" "I got an email from HR," Jessica said. "You were fired." "For misconduct. That's just corporate politics," Mark said quickly. "Listen, Elena's freezing my accounts. I just need a place to stay for a few days. Silence." "My place is small," Jessica said carefully. "It's temporary," Mark insisted. "Once this settles, I'll have my share. We'll be fine." "My share," she repeated. "Mark, did you put my rent on the company card?" Mark hesitated. Her voice exploded. "Are you serious? They're auditing everything." "Jess, calm down. Don't come here," she snapped. "If you show up, I'm calling the police." The call ended. Mark stared at the dark screen. His phone battery died. Rain began to fall as Mark stood in the driveway, staring at the house that no longer belonged to him. A black SUV drove past, then another, then a police car. They pulled into his driveway. Doors opened. 2-0. Feises stepped out. A man in a grey suit followed, and then Elena. She wore a fitted black suit and heels. No softness, no hesitation. Mark ran toward her. "Elena!" he shouted. She turned slowly. "I didn't set you up," she said calmly. "I just let you be yourself." An officer stepped between them. "Sir, you need to leave." "This is my house," Mark shouted. The property transfer was Finn. "A lies this morning," the lawyer said evenly. "You are trespassing." Mark looked at Elena, desperation breaking through his anger. "I have nowhere to go." She studied him for a moment. Then she said quietly, "You wanted freedom." She turned and walked inside. The door shut behind her. The sound of the lock echoed in the silence. Mark stood frozen. Then he turned away and stepped into the R. Mark walked for nearly an hour. The rain soaked through his suit, turning the expensive fabric heavy and useless. His shoes rubbed his heels raw, but he didn't stop. He didn't know where he was going, only that standing still felt worse than moving. For the first time in years, no one was waiting for him. No car, no driver, no assistant, no wife. Just him. And the consequences, by the Tim. He reached the edge of town. His anger had replaced the shock. Anger was familiar. Anger gave him energy. Anger made him feel like himself again. "She thinks she's won," he muttered. "She thinks this is over." It wasn't. Mark Sterling didn't lose quietly. He found shelter in a small cafe near the train station, cheap, dimly lit, smelling of burnt coffee and old furniture. People glanced at High, and then looked away. To them, he was just another soaked man with a suitcase and nowhere to be. He ordered the cheapest thing on the menu and sat in the corner. That was when he remembered something Elena had forgotten to take from him. His mind. Mark had built his career on numbers, systems, and loopholes. He knew how money moved. He knew where it hid. He knew which rules could be bent wit. Hout snapping. And more importantly, he knew secrets. The company wasn't as clean as Elena believed. There were offshore structures, shell accounts, creative accounting tricks they had used in the early years to survive. Mark hadn't acted alone. He'd designed the system, but others had benefited from it. If he was going down, he wouldn't go alone. His phone buzzed. 1% battery. A notification appeared. Prepaid card balance, $5,000. Mark frowned. He reached into his coat pocket and felt a small card taped inside the lining. A note was attached in Elena's neat handwriting. There's a severance clause. This should keep you afloat. Use it wisely. Mark stared at the note, his jaw tightening. She wasn't just leaving him broke. She was leaving him small. He crushed the knot. In his fist. I don't need your charity, he whispered. But his stomach growled, and pride didn't pay for food. Mark used the card to book a cheap motel on the outskirts of the city. The room was small, the bed thin, the walls stained with old mistakes. It was nothing like the hotels he was used to, but it had a desk, a lamp, and Wi-Fi. That was enough. He opened his laptop. The familiar low of the screen steadied him. He began typing from memory. Account names, transaction paths, shell companies registered under names no one questioned. He didn't need access to company servers. He was the system. An idea formed in his mind, sharp and dangerous. A whistleblower. If he exposed everything, he could destroy Elena's company, her reputation, her perfect image. The government would have to listen. The media would love it, and if he played it right, he might walk away clean. Mark smiled for the first time that day. He spent hours drafting the email. Careful wording, detailed explanations, enough truth to sound credible, but just enough distance to protect himself. He sent it to the IRS tip line, then to a major business news outlet. He leaned back in the chair, exhausted, but satisfied. There, he said softly. Now we're even. He fell asleep with that thought burning in his chest. The next morning, Mark woke to the sound of knocking. Firm, controlled, not housekeeping. His heart jumped. He checked his email. There was a reply from the news outlet. His hands shook as he opened it. They thanked him for the information. Then came the line that froze his blood. The matter you described has already been voluntarily disclosed by the company. The individual responsible for the irregularities has been identified as former executive leadership. Former executive leadership. Mark stared at the screen. Elena had already reported everything, weeks ago. She hadn't hidden the mess. She had cleaned it, and blamed him. The door knocked again, harder. It's time. Mr. Sterling, a voice called. Federal agents, open the door. Mark's breath came fast and shallow. He looked at his laptop, at the emails, at his own digital trail. He hadn't exposed a crime. He had confessed to it. Slowly, Mark stood and walked to the door. He opened it. Handcuffs clicked around his wrists. As he was led outside, he caught a glimpse of a woman across the street. Reet, standing under an umbrella. Jessica. She watched without emotion, then turned away. Mark finally understood. Elena hadn't destroyed him in one move. She had let him destroy himself. The holding cell was colder than Mark expected. Not physically, though the metal bench bit into his skin, but emotionally. The kind of cold that crept into your bones when you realized no one was coming to have you. Mark sat with his hands cuffed in front of him, staring at the grey concrete floor. The arrogance that once lived in his posture was gone. He looked smaller now, older. A federal agent stood nearby, flipping through a folder. Mark Thomas Sterling, the agent said without looking up. You understand the charges against you? Mark swallowed. I was trying to help, he said hoarsely. I exposed corruption. The agent finally looked at him. You documented it, he replied flatly, and you signed it. Mark's mouth opened, then closed. There was nothing left to argue. Hours later, Mark sat across from a public defender in a narrow interview room. She was young, efficient, and already tired of him. The evidence is extensive, she said. Emails, transaction records, your own written explanations. The company cooperated fully. Elena set me up, Mark snapped. She knew everything. The lawyer didn't react. She reported it before you did. That matters. Mark leaned back in his chair, his hands trembling. So what happens now? She closed the folder. You're being charged with wire fraud, embezzlement and conspiracy. Best case, a plea deal. How much time? Hesitated. Several years. The word echoed in his head. Years. News spreads fast when someone falls. By evening, Mark's name was everywhere. Online articles, financial blogs, comment sections filled with strangers tearing him apart. Disgraced CFO arrested in federal investigation. Company cleans house after executive misconduct. He searched his name obsessively, scrolling through headlines. Ike, they might change if he refreshed enough times. They didn't. There was no mention of Elena beyond a single line. Company now led by majority shareholder, Elena Sterling. That was it. No scandal, no suspicion. Just him. Mark was released on bail the next morning. He walked out of the courthouse, alone, blinking in the sunlight like someone waking from a long nightmare. Reporters shouted Q. Questions. Cameras flashed. Mark, did you steal from the company? Is your wife responsible for this? Do you feel betrayed? He didn't answer. He didn't have the strength. Days turned into weeks. Mark rented a small room in a rundown part of town using what little money he had left. He sold his watch, then his laptop, then the last suit worth anything. No firm would return his calls. No. Friend wanted to be associated with him. Even his parents stopped answering. He watched Elena from a distance, on screens, interviews, press releases, charity galas. She looked composed, focused, untouched. The company announced a restructuring. Profits rose. Investors praised the leadership. Mark realized something painful. The company didn't need him. It never had. One afternoon he received a thin envelope in the mail. No return address. Inside was a single page. Plea agreement offer. 5 years. Reduced sentence in exchange for full cooperation. Mark stared at the number for a long time. 5 years. He thought about the house, the dinners, the lies, the choices he'd made when he thought he was untouchable. Slowly he picked up a pen and signed. That night, Mark sat, alone on his bed, the room dim and silent. For the first time, no anger came, no plan, no fight. Just a heavy realization settling in his chest. He hadn't lost because Elena was cruel. He had lost because he was careless. And tomorrow, the consequences would become permanent. Prison didn't look the way Mark had imagined it. There were no dramatic shouts, no violent chaos, no moment that felt like a movie. It was worse. It was quiet. The bus came to a slow stop, and the doors hissed open. Mark stepped down with the other men, his wrists cuffed, his belongings reduced to a small plastic bag. The air smelled of metal, disinfectant, and something lifeless. A guard shouted instructions. Mark barely listened. This wasn't a nightmare anymore. This was real. Processing took hours. His clothes were taken, his watch gone, his wedding ring confiscated. He was handed a uniform that didn't fit and shoes that had belonged to someone else. Inmate 49,201, the officer said flatly. That's you now. Mark opened his mouth to correct him, then stopped. There was no point. His cell was small, concrete walls, a narrow bed, a toilet without privacy. The door closed with a heavy mechanical sound. Mark sat on the bed and stared at the floor. For the first time in decades, there was nothing to manage. No emails, no calls, no leverage. Just time. Too much of it. The first weeks were the hardest. Not because of violence, but because of insignificance. No one cared who he had been. No one cared what he had earned. No one cared how important he once thought he was. He OD in line for food like everyone else. Waited for counts like everyone else. Followed rules he couldn't bend. And every night when the lights dimmed, the same thought came back. She's still out there. Mark got a job in the prison library. It was quiet work. organizing books, repairing old spines, stamping return dates. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had once mocked Elena's father for being a librarian. Now, it was the only place that felt safe. One afternoon, a younger inmate sat across from him. "You're the finance guy, right?" the man asked. Mark nodded. "Crazy," the inmate said. "All that money, all that power, gone." Mark didn't respond. He had learned something important. Talking about the past didn't bring it back. Months passed, then years. Mark aged quickly. His air thinned. His confidence eroded. He learned to keep his head down, to survive by being invisible, and invisibility hurt more than punishment. One evening, an inmate slid into the seat beside him, holding a contraband phone. "Hey," he whispered. "You ever look up your ex?" Mark hesitated, then nodded. The screen lit up. A video played. Elena stood at a podium, calm and composed, speaking. About a new international project. Investors applauded. Cameras flashed. She looked strong, free, happy. Mark watched in silence. She never mentioned him. Not once. That night, Mark lay on his narrow bed, staring at the ceiling. He finally understood. Prison wasn't his real punishment. Being forgotten was. 5 years can change a man. Mark used to measure time in deals, deadlines, and quarterly reports. Now he measured it in counts, meals, and lights-out announcements. Days blended into weeks, weeks into years. And slowly, something inside him faded. Not hope, ego. The prison library was quiet that afternoon. Mark sat at his usual table, repairing the spine of an old paperback. His hands were steady now. They didn't shake anymore. Anger had burned itself out long ago, Levy. Only a dull acceptance behind. A voice broke the silence. Sterling. Mark looked up. A guard stood near the doorway. "You've got a visitor." Mark frowned. "No one visits me," he said flatly. The guard shrugged. "Guess today's different." The visiting room smelled like plastic chairs and bad coffee. Mark sat down, waiting. The door opened. For a brief second, his heart betrayed him. Then reality settled in. It wasn't Elena. It was David. Older. Grayer. Better dressed than Mark remembered. They sat across from each other, separated by a small table. Neither spoke at first. "You look," David began, then stopped. "Different." Mark gave a small shrug. Prison has a way of simplifying things. David nodded, uncomfortable. "I didn't come to argue." "Good," Mark replied. "I am tired of arguments." David slid a folded newspaper across the table. Mark didn't touch it. "You should see it," David said. Mark unfolded the paper slowly. The headline stared back at him. "Sterling Vance announces record profits. Global expansion approved." Below it was a photograph. Elena, standing confidently at the center of a group of executives. She looked calm, powerful, untouché. By the wreckage Mark had left behind. "She's changed the company," David said quietly. "Cleaned everything up. No shortcuts, no games." Mark studied the image. "She always hated shortcuts," he said. David hesitated. "She's getting married." The words landed softly, too softly. "Oh," Mark said. That was all. No pain, no jealousy, no rage, just confirmation. After David left, Mark sat, alone in the visiting room for a long time. Marriage, another life, another future. One that didn't include him. He realized something then, something sharp and undeniable. Elena hadn't just moved on. She had outgrown him. That night, Mark returned to his cell and lay on his bed, staring at the ceiling. For years, he had imagined a moment of revenge, a conversation, a confession, some dram. Attic closure. But there would be none. He wasn't her villain. He wasn't her lesson. He was just a mistake she corrected. And the world hadn't paused without him. It hadn't even noticed. The next morning, Mark sat at breakfast, barely touching his food. A younger inmate across from him laughed loudly, talking about life after release. Plans, dreams, second chances. Mark listened quietly. For the first time, he didn't envy them. He simply accepted that some doors don't reopen. Later that day, while shelving books, Mark found a familiar title, a business ethics textbook. He almost laughed. He slid it back into place and kept working. Because now, finally, he understood the truth. Power doesn't disappear when you lose money. It disappears when no one remembers your name. The release date came without ceremony. No announcement, no apology, no audience. Just a guard calling his number. Inmate 49,201. Pack up. Mark folded the thin blanket on his bed, placed his few belongings into a plastic bag, and stood still for a moment. 5 years earlier, he would have imagined this day with triumph, walking out angry, defiant, ready to reclaim what he believed was his now. Here was nothing to reclaim. The gates opened slowly. Metal screamed against metal. And then he was outside. The world hadn't been waiting. Cars passed. People talked into phones. Someone laughed nearby. Life moved forward without hesitation, without curiosity. No one looked at him twice. Mark stood there in borrowed clothes, holding a small bag, breathing in freedom that felt strangely empty. He had expected relief. What he felt instead was distance. He took a bus to a small town where no one knew his name. He rented a room above a laundromat. Cheap, quiet, forgettable. That was the point. He found work shelving books at a local public library. Minimum wage. Title, no AE. Horrity. Just silence and order. Sometimes, as he repaired torn pages or stamped due dates, he thought about how much he had once despised quiet lives, how he had mistaken calm for weakness, how he had believed that being loud meant being powerful. Now he knew better. One afternoon, while organizing newspapers, he saw her name again. Not in gossip, not in scandal. In an article about urban renewal, Elena Vanderhoven leads International Green City Initiative. There was a photo. She looked older, but lighter, happier, standing beside a man whose hand rested gently at her back. The caption didn't mention Mark, not as an ex-husband, not as a cautionary tale. He wasn't relevant enough to be included. Mark folded the paper neatly and placed it back on the she. That evening, Mark sat alone in his room as the city settled into night. The hum of traffic filtered through the window. Somewhere below, a machine rattled with coins and soap. This was his life now. Simple, small, real, and for the first time, he didn't try to escape it. Mark Sterling had once believed the worst punishment was losing money. He was W.R. Ong. The worst punishment was losing importance, losing identity, becoming invisible in a world that once revolved around you. Elena didn't destroy him. She didn't scream. She didn't fight. She didn't seek revenge. She simply moved forward and left him behind. Some stories end with redemption. This one ended with truth, that betrayal compounds, that arrogance blinds, and that the quietest people are often the ones holding all the power. Mark learned that lesson too late, and the world went on.